You're listening to a CNA podcast. There are some places in the world where violence and conflict reside, where people have learned that rebuilding is the only certainty. One of those places is the Bangsamoro region in the southern Philippines. It's made up of 5 provinces, 3 other component cities, and dozens of villages that separately voted for their inclusion, known as the Special Geographic Area. A deal was signed between the Philippine government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF, in 2014. But the violence hasn't ended.
Years into the transition process, recurring clashes and security woes continue to hound parts of the conflict-ridden region, like this clash early this year.
Flare-ups are causing concern as the region heads towards its first ever elections, set for October. This week, CNA's Buena Bernal joins me to talk about the Bangsamoro region and why some are worried that its hard-fought peace may not last. Hi, Buena. Welcome back.
Happy to be here and speak with you again.
This is a great example of how sometimes, as a journalist, you can expect to tell one story, but you get thrust into the telling of another. Initially, I understand you wanted to look at the transition from terrorism to tourism in Sulu province, but then that all changed because something happened in January.
That's right. Violence erupted in January on the island province of Basilan. That's one of the 5 provinces you mentioned. That's part of what's called the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, which was given autonomy by virtue of that 2014 landmark peace deal that led to a 2018 law that led to a 2019 plebiscite on which localities will be part of the region. Now, last January 22, members of the Philippine military were attacked by lawless elements. These army troopers were tasked to escort humanitarian workers from the United Nations. And that attack led to a 30-minute firefight. It's worthy to note that Basilan as a province has actually undergone significant strides in terms of stability building. The last clash of this scale was in 2022. But that clash in January led to 4 dead. 2 of them were soldiers and 12 others were wounded. They were started by what peace and security advocates call peace spoilers, lawless elements. But sources I spoke to said some 50 state troopers eventually ended up fighting against some 70 armed community members, and most of them was from the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF. That's the country's largest Muslim rebel group that is in an ongoing peace process with the national government. So I had to piece together that narrative from different witnesses on the grounds who said that troops were fired at even as they were extricating their wounded and dead. And there's an indigenous concept called pintakasi, which refers to the well-known Filipino spirit of community action. But in communities used to war, you have to understand that before that peace deal between the MILF and the national government, there was nearly 40 years of war between these 2 factions. So especially in communities where there are still armed combatants, when there's a firefight going on and one of the factions there involves your kin or your relatives, when you're fired at, you fire back if you bear arms. And bearing arms is almost a norm in communities in the Bangsamoro because of the decades of war that they've gone through. So what happened was basically what they call pintakasi. As state forces reinforced their troops, so did the community, especially the men who were armed there. So it's another deadly clash, despite that 2014 permanent ceasefire agreement. And when I was there was a deep sense of disappointment, betrayal, confusion from everyone, from the civilians to the military to the MILF members. And what I realized there is that in the context of war, you can dictate operations, but you cannot dictate emotions. I saw the frustration. I saw the sadness in the eyes of the troops, in the eyes of the community members. And this is the basic premise from which the Mindanao is the group of islands in southern Philippines where BARM is located, where the Mindanao peace process story needs to be understood. The basic premise of the ongoing peace process in southern Philippines is that everyone we spoke to has strong emotions. But everyone is also mustering the courage for empathy and good faith to sit down at the negotiating table and engage in dialogue because they know that the end, i.e., peace in the region, is more important than what they're currently feeling. So the great grand duty and project of peace building in southern Philippines is possible because of the generosity with which Filipinos choose to deal with each other. And it's sexier to talk about the clash. It's sexier to talk about war. But after that coverage, I saw that this is a story about peace building, ultimately. I spoke with the chairman of the peace implementing panel of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, Mohagerik Bal, and this is what he had to say.
War is something that is not good for everyone. Everyone is a loser. After all, we belong to the same country. Government forces die, MILF die, we lost. So that's why the only option is really to have peace.
My editors had the foresight and used their discretion to send me to the scene when I told them a clash happened. And I'm glad we did go because what we learned provided so much insight to the peace process. So after that clash, a mechanism for dialogue was triggered. Investigations would determine who the source of violence are. And the people in the peace panel, they're very cautious to identify that the peace spoilers are specific people involved in the attack and that it'll be dangerous to generalize it as having emanated from the MILF as an institution as a whole. So this kind of dialogue after hostile encounters between the MILF and government troops is exactly what has occurred over the years since 2014.
So you've traveled to the town where the January attack happened. Can you tell me about the journey there? I'm curious, how hard was it to reach? Did you even feel safe?
As journalists, we're trained to mitigate risks. So personally, I wouldn't say that there was a threat to my personal sense of safety. I do have a personal routine before going out on difficult environments. It's easy to forget that armed conflict is still a reality in some communities because many of us live in gated villages or condominiums where you sleep in your air-conditioned room at the end of a long work day. And to some, displacement is a constant reality. To some, the sound of guns being fired wakes them up at night and almost as an instinct moves them to pack their belongings and go to safer ground. I spoke with a village chief in that community named Ali sa Lakuran Nuril. And as a child, Ali was actually already experiencing armed conflict. He remembers carrying his younger brother on his back, fleeing from gunfights. And yet he said the January clash brought back memories of that as a child.
Bullets can be indiscriminate. I ran for cover. Civilians fled. I told another village council member to pull out the civilians so that they are not fired at. I hope they never experience this again.
In 2014, the Philippine government and the country's largest Muslim rebel group, MILF, they did put pen to paper. They signed a landmark peace deal. But Buena, it's been a slow march towards self-governance. Finally, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, they're gearing up for its first parliamentary elections in October. How likely are they to go ahead and what stands in their way?
You have to understand that these former rebels are transitioning to becoming civilians, laying down their arms. And these rebel leaders are also transitioning to becoming social leaders, community leaders, and even political leaders. So part of what they're asking from the national government is to speed up their amnesty applications prior to the first parliamentary elections. The former rebel leaders, understandably, because they were involved in war, have pending criminal cases, and they applied for amnesty. And the spokesperson of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, named Mod Asnin Pendatun, has said that it is their hope that all these amnesty applications would not be rejected prior to the elections, because that is exactly the point of the peace deal. The point of the peace deal was for armed struggle to transition to political struggle. And that's also exactly why the MILF created a political party called the United Bangsamoro Justice Party. And it is worthy to note that in all of the Philippines, UBJP is the only ruling party whose battle cry is justice. There's a lot of problems when you transition from war to politics. And part of that is learning how to govern. And there's also a lot of talk. In fact, there is an ongoing hearing in the House of Representatives that looks into fund misuse in the Bangsamoro region. So there's also allegations of corruption and excess in terms of the discretion that was given to that region. That region was provided a block grant, meaning to say there's an automatic allocation for that region in comparison to other regions that have to lobby for the allocation in the national budget. They have an automatic one, at least in the first few years after the creation of BARM, or the Bangsamoro region. So governance means prudent use of funds, but also governance means expedited use of funds. What I mean by that is, if you're allocated a fund, better make sure that you use it. Mm-hmm. And when the audit comes, the common criticism to some of the ministries in the Bangsamoro region is that some of the funds are unused.
You also spoke to the MILF's longtime peace negotiator who told you, for the rebels, the transition from militancy to dialogue, from combat to governance and election and voting, it's really difficult.
That's right. Because when they were in armed struggle, they weren't exactly allowing a lot of their members to run for public office. They had endorsed some candidates in the past, but unlike now, where they have a political party, where the MILF's leaders are among the leaders in that interim government, because part of the deal is to create a transition government prior to the parliamentary elections, a lot of the leaders now are actually MILF leaders. So Mr. Iqbal even told me about his time as Mujahideen, as a revolutionary, where he said, our houses were on our backs, and they did really feel the injustice, especially after the 1968 Jabida massacre, where Moro army recruits were planned to be sent to Sabah to recapture Sabah. Sabah, of course, a locality that's disputed between Malaysia and the Philippines. And he remembers being among the first to be trained in Malaysia following that massacre, trained for combat, to undergo combat training. So this secessionist movement started as a political movement called the Muslim Independence Movement that wanted for Southern Philippines to be independent from the Philippines. And later there were breakaway groups. Prior to the MILF, there was the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, which the government also had a peace deal with. So there are criticisms, in fact, that we started with ARM being the autonomous region that was created following the peace deal with MNLF, the umbrella organization prior to MILF. And now you have BARM, the autonomous region that was created following the peace deal with the MILF. And there are critics who say we might as well go through the letters of the alphabet. ARM, BARM, CARM, get to ZARM. But at some point that there has to be some appeasement of the political discontent. That if you're going to use poverty and injustice as the reason for the armed struggle, that when you're already in power, that you should do your level best, as Mr. Iqbal calls it, to ensure that these roots of the insurgency, poverty, lack of jobs, injustice, are dealt with. And right now, there are some quarters who are pushing for an inclusive BARM. Among them are what we call the non-Moro indigenous peoples, because while the Moros are the Muslim natives in the Philippine South, there are also non-Muslim natives who are the minority of minorities. Muslims being the minority in Catholic majority Philippines, but non-Muslims in southern Philippines are the minority of minorities in that region. So there's a lot of tension there. And the non-Muslim natives in the region hope that they are not left behind, even as the Bangsamoro attains its long-fought progress. True, the region's poverty rate fell from a high of 52.6% in 2018 to 23.5% in 2023 now, which means that there really is tangible progress since that 2019 plebiscite that created the region. And although it is ravaged by decades of war, it's no longer the poorest region in the Philippines. But there have been issues with non-Moro IPs having pending applications in the national government in terms of their land claims. And now because there's an autonomous region, some of the leaders initially wanted them to restart those applications and now before the regional government.
Clan politics, let's talk about that. They're a defining feature of the Bangsamoro region. Infighting between MILF factions is threatening to upend the political progress that's been made so far. Can you tell me why these groups don't see eye to eye? What's the conflict here?
There's a lot of sources of violence in the Bangsamoro region, and there's what is called by the security sector as horizontal conflicts. So these are conflicts over land, over revenge killings as well. For example, the clan feud that we went to and covered involved a series of revenge killings linked to a botched arranged marriage years ago. And I won't go into the details because it's almost funny to hear it from the MILF commander who mediated in this clan feud to always say, despite the level of violence that he's trying to tell me, to always say the caveat at the end, that's just a small misunderstanding. So he would tell me about massacres of 9 people, about an attempt against his life, his driver being gunned down in broad daylight, about 2 factions of the MILF fighting in a series of gunfights every night that led to a 7-hour firefight by February 3 and displaced 50 families. And then suddenly he goes with a caveat, it's just a small misunderstanding. Violence has been so normalized in many communities that they have to be empowered to unlearn violence. And that's exactly what some of the development agencies are doing. Experts are saying this preference for gun ownership was shaped by decades of war, but was also shaped by the thinking that your personal sense of safety and security cannot be outsourced to law enforcement. That has been the distrust that they have against state security forces, because in the past, these injustices and massacres against their people were committed by state security forces.
On the point of guns, in your report, you talk about how peace obviously requires the MILF to lay down their arms. It makes sense, right? But it is so much easier said than done.
That's right. As part of the peace deal, the members or the armed combatants of the MILF would need to lay down their arms in a process called decommissioning. When they decommission, they will get cash, some 100,000 Philippine pesos, and a socioeconomic package. But Philippine law permits the private ownership of guns. And so because there is a preference to not outsource your personal sense of safety to security forces and instead make sure that your family is safe through whoever is the patriarch in the family, then it becomes really hard for certain families to abandon gun ownership. And it's not like gun ownership per se is the problem. It's really that there has been a social problem of resorting to violence, as in the case of that clan feud that we covered, when things go wrong or when your sense of stability and safety is threatened. The MILF commander that I spoke to, JP Filmin Imran, as well as the village chief in Basilan that I spoke to, Ali Sakaluran Luril, both of them say they are encouraging the community to not resort to violence. So it's not like this is so pervasive that everybody resorts to violence. It's not like that. Again, peace spoilers is how security advocates and peace advocates call these minute sources of violence. But according to Climate Conflict Action Asia, the sources of violence in the Bangsamoro region has actually shifted from clashes between government troops and the MILF into MILF infighting. In fact, they have monitored that 13 of the 28 active clan feuds as of February 2025 involved the MILF. Climate Conflict Action Asia's Executive Director Francisco Pancho Lara Jr. told me as much.
He even cited evidence about interviews made of those who had been decommissioned and reported that they used the money they received to buy new weapons. So it's clear that the weapons are flowing inside the Bangsamoro with wanton disregard for any decommissioning project.
Before we go, Buena, the first parliamentary elections of the Bangsamoro region, it's set to take place in just 7 months from now, but a lot can happen between now and then. After you spoke to locals and advocates and everyone kind of involved in this region, do you think peace is fraying at the edges, or is the region really ready to start a new chapter?
What you have to understand in this coverage of the January clash between government troops and some members of the MILF, as well as the February clan feud between two MILF commanders that we covered, is that ultimately when violence erupts, it is the civilians who bear the brunt of that fighting. But again, what prevails here is the Filipino spirit of pintakasi no longer being used to reinforce troops or to reinforce armed community members for engaging in firefight, but pintakasi in terms of peace building. The Philippines is vying for a non-permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council by 2027. And part of that campaign is to underscore the Philippines' role as a pathfinder, because finding paths to peace is exactly what the country is doing in southern Philippines.
Buena, thank you so much for your insights on an incredibly volatile region that could be on the cusp of a new beginning. Appreciate this.
Always grateful for the privilege of bearing witness.
Catch up on all of Buena's reports from the Philippines on YouTube and also on CNA.Asia. There are also TV episodes of CNA Correspondent every Wednesday. They're at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. I'm Teresa Tang. The team behind this week's episode is Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, and Craig Dale. A new episode comes out next Wednesday. Join us then. Bye for now.